The wind had shifted. Elias Hall paused, one knee in the snow, his hand steady against the stock of his rifle as he listened. The world around him was silent, eerily so, considering the forest teemed with life just hours earlier. He scanned the horizon, squinting through the thickening flakes, trying to catch any sign of movement. The elk tracks he had been following had disappeared under a fresh layer of snow, their once clear path now little more than a suggestion beneath the icy blanket. He cursed under his breath, rising to his feet and pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. The storm had come in fast, faster than he could have anticipated, and it was getting worse by the minute. Snow swirled in fierce, erratic gusts, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Elias was no stranger to winter storms. He'd been a hunter all his life, and he knew how quickly a mild winter day could turn into a deadly whiteout. But this storm, something about it felt different. The forest had gone too quiet, the wind too sharp, like the wilderness itself was holding its breath. He glanced at the sky, clouds, heavy and dark, rolled in, blocking out the sun completely. Time had slipped away while he was tracking the elk. He had hours, maybe less, before night fell, and with the storm worsening, he needed to find shelter soon. Elias turned back the way he'd come, retracing his steps toward the foothills. His boot prints were already fading under the new snow, and soon, the landscape around him blurred into an indistinguishable mass of white. The trail he'd followed was gone. A ripple of anxiety moved through him as he realized just how quickly the storm had erased his way home. He pushed it down, refusing to let panic take hold. He'd survived worse. He would survive this. But as the wind howled louder, almost as if in mockery of his confidence, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After what felt like hours of trudging through the endless snow, Elias saw it, a dark shape looming in the distance, half obscured by the storm's fury. For a moment, he thought it might be an illusion, his mind playing tricks on him in the growing twilight, but as he pushed forward, the outline solidified into the unmistakable form of a cabin. Relief flooded through him. The cabin was small, weathered by the elements, but it was standing. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, barely visible in the swirling snow. Someone was inside. Shelter. Warmth. Elias quickened his pace, his boots sinking deeper into the drifts with each step. When he finally reached the cabin, he hesitated at the door. The windows were dark, and though the smoke from the chimney suggested a fire, there was no other sign of life. No sound, no movement. He knocked once, twice, the sound dull against the thick wood. Nothing. After a moment, he pushed the door open. It creaked, the noise unnaturally loud in the stillness, and Elias stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the freezing cold outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. For a second, Elias allowed himself to relax, shaking the snow from his coat and stomping the cold from his feet. Then he saw it. A figure sat in a wooden chair by the fire, hunched and motionless, its back turned to Elias. The figure was wrapped in a long, tattered coat, a hood pulled low, obscuring its features. The firelight danced off the figure's silhouette, but there was no movement, no shift of breath, no flicker of acknowledgement. Elias stared at the figure, unease prickling the back of his neck. I didn't mean to barge in," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cabin's oppressive silence. "Storm's bad out there. I just need a place to warm up for a bit." The figure didn't respond. Elias hesitated, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Maybe the person was asleep, or sick. Or worse. He took a cautious step forward, peering around to try and get a better look. Still, nothing. No movement, no sound. His heart began to race, though he couldn't quite say why. He was no stranger to solitude, he often spent weeks at a time hunting alone in the wilderness. But this silence, this felt different. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the very air in the cabin was waiting for something to happen. He cleared his throat, louder this time. "Mind if I sit for a while? Just until the storm lets up?" No answer. Elias clenched his jaw, forcing himself to turn away from the figure and focus on the fire. It was warm, too warm, almost, and yet the chill in the air seemed to creep under his skin, lingering even as he held his hands out to the flames. The fire crackled, wood popping in the silence, and Elias stole another glance at the figure. It hadn't moved. Not even a twitch. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt strange in the cabin, stretched out by the suffocating stillness. Elias tried to relax, tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but the longer he sat, the more his nerves frayed. Something about the figure was wrong. It wasn't just the silence, though that was unnerving enough. It was the way the figure seemed present, like it was aware of him, watching him even though it hadn't moved or spoken. His thoughts began to spiral. What if the person wasn't alive? What if he had walked into something far worse than just a storm? He shook the thought away, chastising himself for letting his mind run wild. He was just tired. Cold. That was all. But when he glanced back at the figure, it seemed closer. Elias blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't heard any movement, hadn't seen the figure shift. But it was definitely closer. He was sure of it. A thin line of sweat ran down the back of his neck despite the cold. He stared at the figure, his breath shallow, waiting, hoping for it to move again, to prove to him that it was just his imagination. But it didn't. He swallowed, his throat dry. The shadows seemed to lengthen around him, the corners of the cabin growing darker as the fire burned lower. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and thick, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elias couldn't take it anymore. He stood abruptly, his pulse racing. "I think I'll be going," he muttered, his voice shaky. He didn't wait for a response this time, not that he expected one. He just needed to get out. As soon as Elias stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The snowstorm had worsened, far beyond what it had been when he'd entered the cabin. The wind howled, flinging sharp flakes into his face, and the cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He stumbled forward, desperate to get away from the cabin and the strange, silent figure inside. Every step was a struggle, the snow so deep now that his boots sank into it with every movement. The wind tore at him, forcing him back toward the cabin, but he pushed through, teeth gritted, his entire body shaking from the cold. He couldn't explain why he was running, why the fear that clawed at his chest felt so primal, so desperate. All he knew was that he had to get away. Ahead, through the swirling white, he saw the outline of another cabin. McGregor's place. His heart leapt at the sight of it, and he stumbled toward the faint light in the distance, barely keeping his footing in the deepening snow. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. The storm closed in around him, howling like a living thing, and the cabin he had fled from disappeared into the swirling white. As Elias reached McGregor's cabin and pushed open the door, the feeling of dread lifted, if only slightly. But even as he stepped inside, slamming the door against the storm, the memory of the silent figure burned in his mind, and the cold that had settled in his bones refused to leave. The wind had quieted to a low whisper by morning, but the memory of the previous night's storm still lingered in the form of towering snowdrifts that swallowed the landscape. Elias sat by the stove in McGregor's cabin, staring into the low flames, though his mind was far from the small comforts of the crackling fire. His heart still pounded with the residual fear of what he had seen, or thought he'd seen, in the cabin the night before. McGregor's absence nagged at him, but Elias pushed it aside. He had to know. The storm's fury had subsided, and the wilderness, blanketed in an almost serene layer of fresh snow, beckoned him back. The silence outside the cabin felt heavier than it should, as if the world were waiting for him to make a decision. He stood, pulling on his coat and gloves with more determination than he felt. The unease in his chest warred with his instinct for rationality. There had to be an explanation for what had happened. Perhaps the storm had simply disoriented him. Maybe the figure was just a trick of the firelight or his mind playing games with him after hours in the cold. "I'll go back," he muttered to himself. "In daylight, I'll see the truth." The trek back to the abandoned cabin was quiet, the air still and crisp. Each step felt heavier as he approached, the trees looming tall and stark against the snow, their bare branches seeming to reach for him. The path, barely visible beneath the snowfall, twisted in familiar ways, yet somehow felt alien. Every part of him wanted to turn back, but something deep inside, a gnawing need for answers, pushed him forward. Ahead, the cabin appeared through the trees, half buried in snowdrifts. Its roof sagged under the weight of the storm, and the chimney, which had once trailed faint wisps of smoke, was silent. Elias paused at the edge of the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The cabin looked different in the daylight, older, more decrepit. It wasn't just the snow burying it that made it seem abandoned. The windows were shattered, the door hung askew, and the roof sagged as though it hadn't been tended to in years. He forced himself to approach, though his legs felt leaden. The closer he got, the more details emerged, thick layers of dust on the windowsills, snow piled against the inside of the door as though it hadn't been opened in years. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the snow-covered floorboards. Inside, the cabin was a ruin. Furniture was overturned, broken as if ravaged by time and neglect. The fireplace, which had blazed so warmly the night before, was nothing but a cold, crumbling pile of stones. The air was thick with the smell of decay and mildew, and yet, despite the disrepair, it was unmistakably the same cabin he had fled. But then he saw it. In the same chair by the fireplace, in the exact spot where the silent figure had sat, was a body. The corpse was decayed, barely recognizable as human, its skin shrunken against bone, its clothing rotted and stained with age. Hollow eye sockets stared vacantly toward the fire that no longer burned. Elias felt the blood drain from his face as his mind struggled to process the sight. How could this be the same figure? The person had been alive last night, hadn't they? He stumbled backward, his heel catching on something hard. As he regained his balance, his eyes flicked down to the floor. There, carved into the wooden planks, was a message, freshly etched into the dust-covered surface. "You'll never leave." Elias' breath hitched in his throat. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick and oppressive. The figure hadn't moved. Not since the night before. But now it was a corpse. The words on the floor felt like a physical weight pressing down on him, as if the cabin itself was mocking his attempts to escape the fear it held. His pulse raced, panic clawing at his throat. He had to get out of there. Elias turned on his heel and bolted for the door, his boots pounding against the floorboards. He burst outside into the biting cold, but as soon as he stepped into the open, the wind howled to life, whipping snow in violent swirls around him. The clear sky had vanished. Thick, dark clouds rolled in with unnatural speed, and the air crackled with an energy that sent a chill deeper than any winter could. Elias' breath came in short, sharp gasps as the snowstorm began to rage once more, its fury as sudden and intense as the night before. Each step forward felt like walking into a wall of ice, the wind pushing him back toward the cabin with a force that shouldn't have been possible. The snow was blinding, a solid wall of white that swallowed everything. He couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, and every time he tried to move away from the cabin, the storm grew worse. His chest tightened, the realization dawning on him that the storm was not natural. It was as if the wilderness itself was alive, refusing to let him leave. The path, the trees, everything around him blurred into one mass of white, and he felt as though he was running in circles. Desperation clawed at him, urging him to move faster, but no matter how hard he fought against the wind and snow, he could feel it dragging him back, pulling him toward the cabin, like it had claimed him. A sharp crack echoed through the storm, louder than the wind. Elias whipped around, heart hammering in his chest. He could barely see anything through the thick curtain of snow, but there, just beyond his reach, was the figure. It stood still in the storm, its shape hazy but unmistakable. The figure hadn't moved since the night before, but now it was out here, in the snow, standing just far enough away that Elias couldn't make out its face. His breath caught, the cold air burning his lungs. His legs refused to move, frozen in place as he stared at the figure. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body was paralyzed, transfixed by the sight of the figure that had somehow followed him. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Elias turned away, forcing himself to focus on the distant outline of McGregor's cabin through the blizzard. His only hope was to get there, to reach safety, though the figure haunted every step. The wind screamed in his ears, and with every step he took, he could feel the figure growing closer, even though it never moved. He knew, without needing to look, that it was behind him, following him. By the time Elias stumbled toward McGregor's cabin, his entire body felt numb, his limbs heavy with exhaustion and cold. The wind had nearly knocked him to the ground more than once, but now, as the cabin's shape loomed ahead of him, he felt a flicker of hope. He pushed himself forward, his legs burning with the effort, and reached for the door, throwing it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. McGregor was nowhere to be seen, and the stove was dead, the warmth that Elias had left behind now nothing more than a memory. "McGregor," he called, his voice raw from the cold and panic. Silence answered him. Elias moved through the cabin, searching for any sign of the old man, but there was nothing, just an empty cabin, untouched by life. In the corner, an old journal sat on the table, its pages open as if someone had been reading. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he scanned the pages. The writing was old, faded, but the words leapt out at him like a scream, stories of the cabin in the hills, of those who had entered it and never left. The final entry, scrawled in jagged handwriting, chilled him to the bone. "No one who goes back survives. Once the cabin claims you, there's no escape. You'll never leave." Elias dropped the journal, the realization crashing down on him. He was trapped. The cabin had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others. The storm outside, the figure, it was all part of the curse. He stood in the silent cabin, his heart pounding in his ears, knowing that there was no way out. The storm howled outside, and from the shadows, he could feel the presence of the figure, closer now, waiting for him. Elias stood frozen in the middle of McGregor's cabin, the weight of the old man's journal heavy in his hands. The final words, "You'll never leave," burned in his mind like a brand. The cabin's grip on him had been real from the start. He wasn't just being hunted by the storm outside, he was already caught, already claimed by something older, something darker than the wilderness itself. He dropped the journal onto the table, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The wind outside roared, louder now, as if responding to his realization. It battered the walls of McGregor's cabin, rattling the windows in their frames and sending icy drafts snaking across the floorboards. "I can't stay here," Elias muttered to himself, his voice thin and hoarse. He felt the walls closing in, suffocating him with the stifling cold. There was no time left to think, no time to rationalize what was happening. He had to move, to escape the grasp of whatever force was trapping him. Grabbing his rifle and pulling his coat tighter around his body, Elias glanced one last time at the journal, its pages fluttering in the draft. The door to McGregor's cabin groaned open as he stepped outside, but the storm had already begun its assault. Snow swirled in chaotic gusts, blinding him almost immediately. For a moment, Elias stood at the threshold, staring into the vast expanse of white that stretched before him. He knew what lay behind him in the forest, the abandoned cabin with its silent figure, the cold grip of inevitability. Yet something deeper than fear urged him forward. The hope of survival, however small, called to him through the storm. His boots crunched in the snow as he took his first steps away from McGregor's cabin, the wind pushing against him with terrifying force. He had only one destination in mind now, the abandoned cabin. He had to return, to face whatever waited for him there. Perhaps it was the only way to break free. The path back to the abandoned cabin was a blur of white, snow driving into Elias' face and biting at his exposed skin. The wind howled, carrying with it faint, distorted whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Each step felt like an eternity, as if the snow were pulling him back, fighting his every movement. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of dread and determination that kept him moving. As he neared the clearing where the cabin stood, Elias slowed. The structure emerged from the blizzard like a specter, familiar, yet somehow different. The roof was bowed under the weight of the snow, and the windows, shattered and dark, gave the cabin the appearance of a lifeless corpse. He hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the trees. The whispers in the wind grew louder, insistent, like voices calling him back. His heart raced with the knowledge that once he stepped inside the cabin again, there would be no turning back. But what choice did he have? The storm was relentless, and he was already ensnared in whatever power the cabin wielded. With a deep breath, Elias pushed forward, the snow swallowing his footsteps as he made his way to the door. The cabin loomed before him, a dark presence against the swirling snow. He reached for the handle, half expecting it to be frozen shut, but it swung open easily with a creak, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick with cold and silence. The room was exactly as he had left it, ruined, decayed, and filled with an oppressive sense of something watching. The figure by the fireplace was still there, but now, in the full light of day, Elias could see the truth. The figure was not alive. It was a decayed corpse, slumped in the chair, its rotted flesh hanging from its bones. The hollow eye sockets stared into the cold hearth, unblinking. Elias stepped inside, his breath visible in the frigid air. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved slowly toward the corpse, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The walls seemed to close in around him, the cabin's presence growing heavier with every step. He could feel it, something ancient, something waiting. His gaze shifted to the floor, where the message was still freshly carved into the wood, "You'll never leave." A shiver ran down his spine, colder than the winter air outside. His mind reeled as he fought to understand what was happening. Was he trapped in some kind of endless cycle, doomed to share the fate of the figure before him? Elias took another step toward the figure, his pulse quickening. He couldn't leave, but he had to try. There had to be a way out. As Elias stood near the corpse, the air grew colder, almost unbearable. He could see his breath forming thick clouds in front of him, and his limbs felt sluggish, weighed down by the oppressive chill. He glanced toward the door, but something in the cabin shifted, a presence, an unseen force, blocking his path. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, crawling across the walls, bending the light in unnatural ways. Elias's heart raced as he backed away from the figure, his every instinct screaming at him to run, though he knew it was futile. He was trapped. Then, from the silence, a faint sound broke through. A whisper, low and barely audible, drifted from the corpse's direction. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice as he realized the sound wasn't in his head. The whisper grew louder, clearer, a voice from the figure, speaking as if from some long-forgotten place. "You'll never leave." The words echoed through the small cabin, bouncing off the walls and circling Elias like a predator toying with its prey. He stumbled backward, his hands trembling, and the wind outside howled in response, shaking the walls as if the storm itself were alive and angry. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to lock onto him, though it didn't move. Elias felt something tighten around him, an invisible grip that left him gasping for breath. The words rang in his ears, repeating, consuming him with their terrifying finality. He had to get out. Now. Elias turned, running for the door, but the air thickened around him, pulling him back toward the figure by the fire. His feet felt heavy, as if the very floor was turning to quicksand beneath him, trapping him in place. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around the room like dark tendrils, reaching for him. His lungs burned, his body stiffening as the cold gripped his bones. Elias pushed forward with every ounce of strength he had left, but the door seemed farther and farther away. The storm outside screamed, and the figure's whisper echoed in his mind, "You'll never leave." Elias made it to the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. But when he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the storm outside had fused it shut, trapping him in the cabin's suffocating embrace. He turned, his breath ragged, to face the figure once more. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, closing him off from the world outside. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the time slipping away, the inevitability of the cabin's curse tightening around him. The figure remained still, silent, but Elias could feel its presence growing stronger, the weight of its gaze suffocating him. He was losing himself, his body felt foreign, as though the cold had seeped into his very bones, freezing him in place. A deep, primal fear took hold of him. He was becoming part of the cabin, just like the figure. The whispers in his mind grew louder, filling every corner of his consciousness until there was nothing left but the voice repeating, "You'll never leave." His legs buckled, and Elias collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the cold seeped deeper into him. His vision blurred, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement, the figure shifting, its hollow eyes locked onto him, its decayed hand reaching out. But before he could move, before he could even scream, the cabin swallowed him whole. Elias blinked, but the darkness around him remained. Time had lost its meaning, slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. He couldn't tell if hours or days had passed since the cabin had claimed him. The once familiar crackle of the fire was gone, replaced by an unbearable silence that pressed against his chest like a weight. He no longer felt the cold, though the cabin was frigid, as though frozen in time. His body was stiff, unresponsive. The walls around him seemed to pulsate with a dull, rhythmic throb, like the steady beating of a heart. A heart that wasn't his. Elias stared at the fireplace where the figure had Saturday. Now, the chair was empty. The decayed corpse had vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. But the whispering voices remained. They had quieted but still lingered on the edges of his consciousness, slipping into his thoughts with cold precision. How long had it been since he last moved? Hours? Days? It didn't matter. The cabin had absorbed him, pulled him into its endless stillness, and now he was part of it. He felt it deep in his bones, the slow realization that this place wasn't just a trap, it was alive, feeding off his fear, his desperation. The cabin wanted him. And Elias, as much as he fought to deny it, knew he had already surrendered. The darkness outside had deepened. The snowstorm that had raged so violently before now hovered in a perpetual twilight, casting pale shadows that danced across the cabin's walls. Elias sat motionless by the fire, staring blankly into the hearth. The flames had died hours ago, but he hadn't bothered to stoke them. He couldn't. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point, he had lost control of his body. His limbs felt like they weren't his own, frozen in place as though they were part of the cabin's decaying structure. And in the stillness, he began to hear it again, the faint, rhythmic creak of footsteps. At first, it was distant, barely audible over the whispering winds outside. But as the minutes dragged on, the sound grew louder, closer. Someone, or something, was approaching. Elias strained to move, to rise from the chair, but his body remained immobile, trapped in the same stiff posture. Then, in the corner of his vision, he saw it. The figure had returned. It stood by the door, its shadow cast long and sharp across the floor. The rotting corpse, the hollow eyes, the same tattered coat hanging from its skeletal frame. But this time, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped toward Elias, its hollow gaze fixed on him. Elias's heart raced, pounding in his chest as the figure approached, though outwardly, he remained frozen, paralyzed by the cabin's will. The figure stopped just feet from him, its presence oppressive, suffocating. The whispers in the air grew louder, filling Elias's mind, until all he could hear was a single word, stay. And then, as suddenly as the figure had appeared, the whispers ceased. The cabin was silent once more, save for the faint creaking of the wind against the walls. Elias was alone again. The figure had vanished, leaving only the weight of its presence behind. But something had changed. Through the silence, Elias began to hear a new sound, the crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, clearer, as someone neared the cabin. His heart quickened, and for the first time in what felt like days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Was someone coming? Could this be a rescue? He strained to listen, his body refusing to cooperate as the footsteps approached. The sound of the door creaking open shattered the silence. A gust of cold air blew through the cabin, stirring the dust on the floor. Elias couldn't move, couldn't call out. He could only sit there, frozen, as the footsteps entered the cabin. A figure appeared in the doorway, a traveler, wrapped in heavy winter clothing, snow caked on his boots. He moved cautiously, eyes darting around the cabin's interior, taking in the ruined furniture, the cold hearth, and finally, Elias himself. The traveler stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Elias. Their eyes met, and Elias could see the confusion in the man's face, the way his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Hello," the traveler called out, his voice hesitant, as though uncertain if Elias could hear him. Are you all right?" Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to speak, to warn the man, but no words came. His lips refused to move. His body remained still, frozen in place. The traveler took a step closer, his brow furrowed in concern. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked again, this time louder. "What's going on here?" But Elias couldn't answer. He could only watch as the man stepped farther into the cabin, oblivious to the danger that now surrounded him. The traveler approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder at the door as if considering leaving. But something seemed to compel him to stay, to move closer to Elias. "Are you hurt?" the traveler asked, his voice low, as he knelt beside Elias's chair. "Do you need help?" Elias wanted to scream, to shout at the man to run, to leave before it was too late. But his body refused to obey. He could only sit there, mute and helpless, as the man examined him with increasing concern. "I'll get you out of here," the traveler muttered, more to himself than to Elias. He turned toward the door, as if to leave and return with help. But just as he did, the wind howled, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The traveler jumped, startled, and whirled around to face it, his hand on the door handle. It wouldn't open. "What the?" The traveler yanked on the handle again, harder this time, but the door remained sealed, as though it had become part of the cabin itself. His expression shifted from concern to panic as he struggled against the door, but no matter how hard he pulled, it refused to budge. "Hey," the traveler shouted, his voice trembling now. "What's going on? Let me out." Elias could only watch in horror as the traveler's panic grew. The man turned back to Elias, his face pale. "We're trapped," he whispered. "What is this place?" The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, twisting and warping around the walls. The cold crept in again, and the whispers returned, low and insistent, filling the cabin with their eerie chant. The traveler stepped back from the door, his eyes wide with terror. He glanced around the cabin, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, he saw it. The figure. It stood in the corner of the room, motionless but watching. The traveler's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the decayed, skeletal form. What is that?" the traveler stammered, backing away slowly. "What the hell is that?" The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The traveler's fate had already been sealed. Elias wanted to shout, to warn the traveler of what was to come, but the words stuck in his throat, suffocated by the cabin's grip. The traveler stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on the figure as it slowly, impossibly, began to move. The shadows around the room grew darker, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as the figure glided toward the traveler, its rotted form looming over him. The traveler screamed, his voice breaking as he scrambled toward the far corner of the room. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice filled with terror. "Stay away from me." But the figure didn't stop. It closed the distance between them with unnatural speed, and the traveler's cries were swallowed by the howling wind and the oppressive weight of the cabin's presence. The figure reached for him, its decayed hand stretching out, and the traveler's voice faltered into a desperate gasp. Elias's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold, helpless to intervene. The traveler collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts as the figure loomed over him. The cabin creaked, its walls shifting as if breathing, and the whispers swirled around them both, filling the room with their eerie chant. And then, with one final breath, the traveler's body went still. Elias sat in silence, his heart heavy with dread. The cabin had claimed another victim. He knew, in that moment, that the cycle would never end. The storm outside raged on, and the cabin remained as it had always been, waiting for the next lost soul to wander inside, forever doomed to join the others. Elias sat in the chair by the cold hearth, motionless, his eyes staring blankly into the emptiness of the cabin. He had been sitting like this for what felt like an eternity, his mind no longer able to grasp the concept of time. Every moment was a slow crawl of icy stillness. The once fierce panic had dulled to a quiet, aching resignation. He could no longer remember how long ago the traveler had arrived, or how long it had been since the cabin had claimed him too. There was no point in trying to measure the passage of time. Daylight never seemed to break through the thick blanket of snow that covered the world outside. The storm had become a permanent fixture, a barrier between the cabin and any reality beyond it. The traveler's lifeless body lay crumpled in the corner, untouched by time. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, the last vestige of his brief fight against the inevitable. Elias didn't look at him anymore. He couldn't bear to. The traveler had become part of the cabin now, just as Elias had. Elias's breath fogged the air in front of him, the only sign that he was still alive. Barely. The cold didn't bite as harshly anymore, it had become a part of him, just as the silence had. He couldn't remember the warmth of the sun, the feel of a summer breeze on his skin. All of that was long gone, replaced by the eternal storm and the crushing weight of the cabin's presence. He had accepted it now. He belonged here. The cabin had claimed him, as it had claimed all those before him, and there was no escape. "You'll never leave." The words echoed in his mind, just as they had since the moment he'd read them. A final, cruel reminder of the fate that had always been waiting for him. The wind howled outside, battering the cabin's walls with relentless fury. But through the noise, Elias heard something else, a sound he had come to recognize, though it filled him with nothing but dread. Footsteps. A new traveler was coming. Another lost soul, seeking shelter from the storm, just as he had once done. The realization sent a shiver through Elias, but his body remained still, as if frozen in place by the cabin's will. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. The cabin would lure the traveler in, just as it had lured him, and the cycle would begin again. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of icy air. Snow swirled inside, and through the haze, Elias saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. The traveler's breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale from the cold as he stumbled inside, shaking off the snow. "Hello," the man called out, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. "Is anyone here?" Elias's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wanted to speak, to warn the traveler, to tell him to turn back while he still could. But his lips remained sealed, his body frozen in place. He was powerless, a silent observer in the cabin's cruel game. The traveler took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the room. He seemed to hesitate when he saw Elias, but then relief flooded his face. He saw Elias as another person, another human being trapped in the storm, someone who could help him. "Thank God," the traveler muttered, moving toward Elias. "I thought I was the only one out there. This storm, it came out of nowhere." Elias's heart raced, but he remained unmoving, unable to offer any response. The traveler didn't understand the danger he was in. He was still clinging to the hope that he could survive. The traveler knelt beside Elias, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you all right? You're freezing. We need to get a fire going." The man's hands reached out, shaking Elias gently. But no matter how hard the traveler tried, Elias didn't respond. The cabin had taken him. The wind outside grew louder, more violent, as if the storm itself were responding to the traveler's presence. The cabin groaned under the weight of the snow and wind, its ancient walls trembling as if alive. The traveler stood, his expression shifting from concern to unease as he glanced around the room. He could feel it now, the wrongness that lingered in the air, the oppressive silence that pressed in on him from all sides. "This place," the traveler muttered, his voice low. "Something's not right." Elias wanted to scream, to warn the man to leave while he still could, but the words stuck in his throat. His body felt heavy, as though the cabin itself was holding him in place, forcing him to remain silent, just as it had done with all its victims before him. The traveler moved toward the hearth, inspecting the cold, dead fireplace. He reached for the pile of logs beside it, but his hands trembled, and the wood slipped from his grasp. His movements were slow, as though the cold had already begun to sap his strength. As the traveler fumbled with the firewood, Elias felt the familiar presence creeping into the figure. It was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. The air in the cabin grew heavier, thicker, as though the walls were closing in. And then Elias saw it, the shadow in the corner of the room. It moved slowly, deliberately, toward the traveler. The figure had returned. The traveler froze, his breath catching in his throat as he noticed the figure out of the corner of his eye. He turned slowly, dread washing over his face as he saw the decayed form standing just feet from him. "What the hell?" the traveler whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. His eyes widened in horror as the figure took a step closer. The whispers began again, swirling through the room like a cold breeze. The traveler's face contorted in fear as the figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes locked onto him. Elias felt the familiar weight in his chest, the same crushing sense of doom he had experienced when the figure had first appeared to him. He wanted to help the traveler, to stop what was about to happen, but he couldn't. The cabin wouldn't let him. The traveler backed away, stumbling over the firewood as he tried to escape, but the figure followed, its movements slow and deliberate. The traveler's breath quickened, and his panic became palpable. "No, no, please," the traveler pleaded, but his voice was swallowed by the storm outside. The cabin creaked, the walls closing in as the figure reached for him, its decayed hand outstretched. The traveler's scream was cut short as the figure made contact, and Elias felt the air in the cabin grow even colder, the whispers louder, as the traveler's life was drained from him. His body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The figure vanished, leaving only silence behind, fixed on the lifeless body of the traveler. The cabin had claimed another victim, just as it had claimed him. The cycle would continue, over and over, without end. The storm outside raged on, unrelenting, as though the cabin itself controlled the weather, trapping anyone who dared to enter. Elias could feel it, the cabin was alive, feeding off the souls of those it ensnared, growing stronger with each new victim. The traveler's body lay still, but Elias knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Soon, the cabin would take him, just as it had taken the others. He would become part of the cabin, part of its endless, twisted loop. And Elias would remain in his place by the fire, waiting, always waiting, for the next traveler to arrive. His breath fogged the air in front of him, the only sign that he was still alive. But even that wouldn't last much longer. Elias knew, deep in his soul, that there was no escape. He was part of the cabin now. And soon, the next lost soul would come, seeking shelter from the storm, only to meet the same fate. Elias's lips twitched into a grim, silent smile. The cabin would never be empty for long.